I am really excited about the video today. This is a long time in the making. I am doing a full tutorial on how to make the hiker vest, including how to do the pockets. So the very first thing that I want to show you with this vest is how to knit the linen stitch. So what we're going to do, you can see my yarn is in the front from the last stitch, is I'm going to knit one, and then I'm going to slip one with yarn in front. So that means I'm going to take my yarn from the back, bring it to the front, and then I'm going to insert my needle like I'm going to purl the stitch, but I'm just going to move it instead of purling it. And then I'm going to move my yarn to the back again. I'm going to knit. Then I'll move my yarn to the front, slip one with the yarn in front, and move it to the back again. And I'm just going to keep doing that across this whole row. Okay, so now we get to the back side, the wrong side. This is what the wrong side looks like, all these awesome fun bubbles. And we're going to purl. If you have an even number of stitches, you start with a purl. Otherwise, you start with a slip. And then we're going to slip one with the yarn in the back. So every time we slip a stitch, the yarn will be on the right side of the work. When we slip a stitch on and working right side rows, we bring the yarn to the front. When we're working wrong side rows, we bring the yarn to the back, which is the right side of the work. We're always slipping our yarn on the right side of the work, and that is what makes this really cool stranded texture all over the front and these super fun purl bumps on the back. So we're going to move the yarn to the back of the needle, insert our needle like we're going to purl, but just move it over to slip our stitch, bring the yarn back to the front, purl one, bring our yarn to the back, slip the stitch, bring our yarn back to the front, purl one, and you're going to do that all the way back across. So let's go ahead and talk about, we're going to move on to back decreases. But first I want to talk a little bit of the shape and layout of the full entire pattern. So there's a little sketch in your pattern that shows you exactly what the whole piece is going to look like, because this vest is knit completely in one piece. There is nothing that's seamed on later. So what we're starting on back here is the back. We're going to work the back. We're going to work the armholes, the shoulder short rows, the front armholes, and then the front two pieces. So we're on the back right now, and there is optional waist shaping. So if you do not want the waist shaping, then just don't worry about decreasing and increasing. Just work the same amount of rows, the same number of rows, just without the decreases. So we're going to do the first decrease, which is a knit two together. And then we just continue as usual. And I can see, if I look at this stitch, I can see there's a strand in front of it. And there's no strand in front of this stitch. So I can see just by looking at it, this was stranded the last row. I need to knit it this row. And this was knit the last row. So that's going to be my slip stitch this row. And then I'll just continue like that. So now I'm on the back side of the row, and I'm just going to show you how to do the purl decrease for the other side, because every decrease we do on this side, there's going to be a decrease on this side. That way both sides shape in at the same rate. So every time it says to do a purl two together, you're going to bring your yarn to the front to purl, insert your needle into the first two stitches, purl them as if they're one stitch, and you've worked that decrease. And now I can see by looking at this next stitch, From this side, I look at the purl bumps. So I can see that this purl bump is higher than these two. That tells me that this is the last stitch that I worked. I worked this one last round. I slipped this stitch the last round. So this row, I need to purl these and slip the higher ones. So I'm going to purl, slip, purl, slip, and keep going across the row. Make sure as the number of stitches in your rows change, and everything will continue to change as we're decreasing and increasing. So this stitch I knit, it was the last stitch that I knit in the last row. So before I slip it, I need to make sure I bring my yarn to the front, so when I slip that stitch, it still has that slip in front of it. So now let's talk about the increases. So we've got knit front and back is the first increase that you'll do. So you're going to insert your needle knitwise, and I'm going to knit the stitch, but instead of taking the old loop off of my left needle, I'm now going to insert my needle into the back loop of the stitch and knit one more time, and then I'll take the stitch off. So now I have 2 stitches here instead of 1, and then I will continue in pattern until I get to the next increase. So the next kind of increase that happens in this pattern is going to happen on the wrong side of our work, and it's PFB, purl front back. Let's see, let me get me yarn straightened out here. So I'm going to insert my needle purlwise and purl, and once again I'm not going to take the old stitch off. And now to purl the back, I'm actually going to take my needle behind the stitch and put it up through the middle from this side and purl. So I'll show you that one more time because it's a little funky. So I'm going to purl like normal, just don't remove this stitch. And then I'm going to take my needle behind the stitch, so between the 2 stitches from the back, but I'm going to put it through the middle of the stitch from the back, purl, and take it off. And now I have 2 stitches instead of 1, and then I'm going to continue in pattern until I get to the next increase. Alright, now the piece that I'm showing you to make this tutorial video is not going to be a full-size sample. Hope that's pretty clear from this. I just cast on a random number of stitches. I'm really just using this to show you the techniques you're going to be using. And so it's not going to be completely proportionate sample. I just want to show you everything you're going to need to know. So now let's move on to the armholes. When we get to the armholes, the pattern will tell you to bind off a specific number of stitches. For this, I'll start with 3, which is a completely arbitrary number. And you can use whatever bind off you want. This is my preferred bind off for this. I'm just knitting 2, and then I slip the first stitch over the second, I knit another, slip that first stitch over the second, and so on. So you can see I've bound off 3 stitches now, and then I will work to the other side of the row. So now I've got myself all the way to the other side, and on this side I will match the other side. So the armholes look the same and they line up the same. So now I'm going to bind off 3 more stitches. So I knit 2 or purl 2, and then I slip the first stitch over the second. Purl another stitch, slip that stitch over it, purl another stitch, slip my first stitch over the second, and then I'm going to work my way over to the other side of the row in pattern. So now I've made it back to the other side. You can see we've got those 3 stitches bound off right there. And now it's going to give you another number of stitches to bind off. And so I'll just bind off 1 more stitch for the sake of simplicity. So I bound off 1 more, and then I'm going to work to the other side in pattern. And the reason that we don't bind off all of the stitches all at once is doing it somewhat gradually like this gives us a nice tapered, rounded armhole that looks really nice instead of just being a square armhole, because there aren't more stitches being picked up at any point for this. This is going to be the raw edge armhole, and so it looks much nicer this way. Now we've made it this far, we've got our armholes shaped. And now we're going to start the back shoulder shaping. So we're going to do some short rows here, and we're going to use my favorite method for short rows, and I think it's just really easy to do them this way. So we're going to linen stitch to the last however many stitches the pattern tells you. So I'm going to go to the last 3 stitches. So I'm going to linen stitch in pattern Alright, so I made it to the last 3 stitches. Now I'm going to turn my work. Now I'm going to yarn over, and when I'm on a purl side, I like to yarn over in the opposite way. It traps the yarn over nicely that way, so it's nice and snug. That's just a preference. And then we're going to work in pattern to the last number of stitches it tells you again. So I'll go to 3 because you're going to do the same stitches on both sides. Everything you do to the right side, you're going to do to the left side. So I'm going to linen stitch in pattern to the last 3 stitches. And 3 stitches, that number is completely arbitrary just for this example. Alright, then I'm turning my work, turned it around. Now I'm going to yarn over, and then I'm going to linen stitch in pattern to the last new number of stitches that it tells you. So I guess I'll just go 3 again. And it's to 3 stitches, to whatever number of stitches before the yarn over. So I can see right here, this is my yarn over. I can see I've got a gap here and a funky stitch. So here's the last 3 stitches before the yarn over. So I'm going to turn my work again, yarn over, and then continue in pattern to the other side, where I'll go to the same number of stitches before the yarn over. Whatever your pattern, whatever it tells you for your size. So I can see here, I've got this gap here, this funky kind of half stitch just hanging off this one. Here's my yarn over, and 1, 2, 3 stitches before that. So I'm going to turn. And you'll do that for the number of rows that the pattern tells you to do that for. So now I'm going to get to the next part. I'm going to skip a few rows of short rows, and we're going to move to the next portion where we're going to bind off some stitches and start to take away those short rows. Okay, so this is a really exciting part because this is actually where we're going to split this piece in half for the front, for the 2 halves of the front. So the vest opens up. So we are going to yarn over, and we're going to linen stitch the number of stitches it tells you to. So I'll do 2 stitches, and then you're going to bind off a number of stitches it tells you to bind off. So I'm going to go ahead and start binding off. And your pattern will tell you the number of stitches to bind off. I'm just going to go until I have the same number of stitches on both sides. So let's see, I've got so I'm going to bind off 4 more. Okay, so now I can see I've got the same number of stitches on each side, and then I'm going to linen stitch to the end of the row, and I'm going to take care of these yarn overs. So every time I get to a yarn over, like I've got right here, I'm going to knit 2 together. So I've got the yarn over here and the stitch to the left. So I'm going to stop when I reach the yarn over, and I'll knit 2 together. And what that does is it takes away the yarn over so you can't see it. It's going to hide behind that other stitch. So I've got the yarn over right here, and I've got this big gap. I'm going to knit those together. So I've gotten rid of all of my yarn overs that way. So now that we have this split in half for the 2 sides, we are going to move these stitches to a stitch holder. A scrap piece of yarn works really well for that. And that's because we're not going to use these stitches again until we're done with this whole side. And then we'll come back and we'll work this side. An alternative to that, if you want to keep working everything at the same time, take a second ball of yarn of the same yarn, and then you can use 1 ball of yarn for this side and 1 ball of yarn for this side, and that way, and then you'll just work across the rows, the whole thing, read the instructions for each side. It's a little bit complicated because the instructions might be a little bit different, but you can go ahead and do that if you want to work it all at the same time. I am going to do it how the pattern says. So I'm going to use my little tapestry needle, yarn needle, and I'm going to take all these stitches off. And I'm going to move them here onto my scrap piece of yarn. And then, just for added security, even though this is a huge piece, I'm going to tie a little knot in that, and that way I know those are not going to fall off my stitches. That's not going to come out. I'm not going to lose those. Okay, now we're just working with these stitches, and I'm going to go over something I skipped a little bit as I was working this way. When you are doing the knit 2 together, getting rid of your yarn overs, if you get to a stitch like this one, I had a yarn over next to a stitch that I was supposed to slip. Instead of doing your knit 2 together there, you can just slip the yarn over and the stitch you're supposed to slip, so that when you get to this side, you'll just purl those 2 together, and that way your entire piece, the linen stitch, stays in pattern. So then when I'm working back this row, it says to purl 2 together any remaining yarn overs. So if if I had slipped that stitch like I should have, I would purl it together on this side. So now I'm going to turn, and I am going to linen stitch in pattern to the last X number of stitches that the pattern tells you. I'm going to do 3 stitches again, because that's what I did going the other way. And essentially what we're doing is we have these short rows to shape the little slant of shoulders, and we want to match what we did on the back to the front, so it looks nice and uniform, front and back. The whole thing will fit really nicely that way. So I will linen stitch in pattern for my arbitrary number of the last 3 stitches. For you, do what the pattern says to do for your size. And then I'm going to turn that. And I'm going to yarn over and continue to linen stitch in pattern. And then I'm going to turn. And you can see, since we're only working one side now, we're not worrying about yarn overs on this side. It's only on this side. You'll work the other side of yarn overs when you work this half of the piece. And now I'm going to, let's see, there's my yarn over. So now I'm going to stop. So you will continue to do that the amount of rows, the amount of times that the pattern tells you to do. For the sake of the sample right now, I'm just going to do it this many times. So now I'm going to go back, and I am once again going to get rid of my yarn overs. So I'm going to work down, and I can see, all right, here's a yarn over, and this is a stitch. I should slip this, so I'll show you that right here. I'm going to slip the yarn over and the stitch I'm supposed to slip and go to the end of the row. I'm going to turn it around, and then I'm going to work in pattern across, and here, let's see, that one's a slip stitch, sorry. So I'm going to purl, slip, and then I've got here the 2 stitches that I slipped, and I'm going to purl 2 together that stitch with the yarn over on this side. And that way, I'll show you the front. That way the front remains in pattern right there. So now we're to another really exciting part where we get to see the vest really starting to take its shape. And we're going to start the neckline. So when I say front and left in the pattern, I mean right and left. I'm talking about the wearer's right and left. So if I'm wearing this, this is my right side, this is my left side. So right now we're working the left side. So now we're going to cast on our stitches to start the front neckline. So the way that I like to cast on my stitches, if I'm in the middle of a project like this and I need to cast on some more stitches, I like to use this knit cast on. So I'm going to knit a stitch, and I'm going to leave that old stitch on my needle, and I'm also going to move my new stitch back onto the left needle. And then with my, either keep it in there, or if you take it out, just put your needle right back in knitwise and knit another stitch, and from the bottom slip it back on. Slip it onto the left needle, and you'll just do that until you've added the number of stitches you need to add. I'm adding a completely arbitrary number of stitches. I'm not even sure how many I just added. You will cast on the number of stitches your pattern calls for you to cast on. And then I'm going to work across all of these stitches in pattern. So I'm going to go back where I can see where it is. So I can see that this was slipped, so I'll need to knit this when I get to it. So I would slip this one, knit this one, slip, knit, slip. All right, so I know I need to slip the first stitch and then knit the second, and then slip, knit, slip, knit, and then continue in pattern where it's already been established. And then I'll turn my work, and then I will continue, and I'm just going to work this side without any increases in pattern. And then once I reach the end of this row, the pattern's going to tell me to cast on another number of stitches. And the reason we don't cast them all on at the exact same time, it's the same reason we do it differently for the armhole. It gives us, we've got a nice curved armhole here, and we want a nice curved neckline going on. So I'm going to, I like to start between both stitches. I'm going to cast on, I'll just do, we'll say 3 more stitches. Just a random number. There we go. So I cast on some more stitches, and then once again I'm going to work the way across this row in pattern. So let's go back to where we can see it's established. Let's see, I'm going to knit this stitch. I can see that I slipped it last row. I'm going to knit this stitch. So this one I'll slip, I'll knit this one, I'll slip this one, and I'll knit my first stitch here. And I'll work across the full row. And then I'll just keep working linen stitch in pattern for as many rows as the pattern tells me. I believe the pattern has one more set of increases. Go ahead and work what the pattern tells you to do. I'm just doing a slightly smaller amount for the sake of a sample. I just want to make sure that I show you the techniques for how to do all these things. Okay, so you're going to work the number of rows after the neckline that the pattern tells you to do for your size. And now we're going to do the armhole for the front, which is going to be the reverse from the back. So on the back, we bound off stitches to decrease for the armhole. Now we're going to cast on stitches to increase back out for the armhole. So let's see, I think the back I did 1 stitch for the last decrease, so I'll do 1 stitch for my first increase. So I'm going to increase 1 stitch. You'll increase whatever number of stitches the pattern tells you to do for your specific size. And then like we did last time, now we're going to read our work. So I can see that this stitch, I'm going to need to purl this one, and I'll slip this one. So I'll purl and I'll slip. So I'm going to slip the first stitch, and then I'll finish the row in pattern as it's been established. So now I'm back over here at the beginning of the wrong side row, and I'm going to increase the number of stitches that the pattern tells me to do again. 2, 3, and I'm going to do 3 stitches just because that's the number that the random number I chose back here, and I want it to line up for my sample. So then we're going to look again, and we can see I'm going to need to purl this stitch, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl. So I'm going to purl my first stitch, slip, and then continue as you've established to the end of the row. And at this point, you'll work the number of increases, the amount of times that the pattern calls you to do, and then you're just going to continue in pattern until we get to the front decreases and increases in the pocket. So the only difference in the increases and decreases for the front that are different from the back is that instead of increasing on this side and decreasing on this side and this side, you're only going to decrease and increase on this edge because this is the center. The center is going to stay straight. Your increases and decreases will happen on the outer edge only. So then when you work this side, you're going to work up to the point that we're at, and then you're only going to increase and decrease on this side, the outer edge where the waist is at. The center will have no increases or decreases.